title for my talk is Shakespeare and Every Person Surviving Beyond Academia. And as a school teacher, it's interesting to look at this topic because I suppose, sometimes flirted with academia. I did lecture PGCE students at Rhodes, but there's often a divide between the two. And I'm looking at Shakespeare surviving beyond academia. The statistics are pretty clear. Shakespeare is on his way out in academic institutions. I did a brief survey with nearly every English teacher that I know, and I asked just two questions. In what decade did you study? And roughly, how many Shakespeare plays do you think you studied as an undergraduate? And the trends were obvious. The highest return samples were from the 1980s and the 2000s. I studied from 1979 to 1982. But put simply, the average number of Shakespeare texts studied by undergraduates in the 1980s was 10. One of my respondents was obviously a highly organized student. Not only did she tell me how many Shakespeare plays she had studied, she also still had all of them on the shelf, took a photograph, listed them, and you can understand why she became a headmistress. But she obviously thoroughly enjoyed the study of Shakespeare. For students in the 2000s, the average number of Shakespeare texts studied as an undergraduate was 2. That is a drop of 80%. While I was unable to contact many undergraduates from 2010 onwards, perhaps I need younger friends, the responses showed that they tended to study one Shakespeare as an undergraduate. One Shakespeare or fewer. The reading lists for undergraduate students at Rhodes University does not mention Shakespeare at all. Neither do the reading lists for NMU or Fort Hare. The UCT reading list includes one play by Shakespeare and one by Marlowe, although perhaps the Marlowe play, The Jew of Malta, is more in line with the fairly obvious narrative of anti-Semitism at UCT at the moment. Depending on your electives, at Wits you could study 3 Shakespeare plays. I think we can see the influence of Chris Thurman there. And the reading list for UKZN didn't load. From what we see, it's kind of obvious that Shakespeare is falling away in universities. To say that nowadays it's possible to be awarded a degree in English in South Africa without having studied Shakespeare is more than possible. It's likely. I'm not arguing that Shakespeare has to be studied, but I do believe he's important. There are other texts that I believe are equally important. I believe every high school pupil should study The Crucible. I also believe that every school should teach the mini-series Adolescence. These are important lessons that we can teach to younger people. I'd initially wanted to call this talk Shakespeare and the Common Man, but truly preferred the every person as a more inclusive term, and I can understand that. But as I worked on this paper, I began to realize that, particularly at the start, I'd like to use the common man descriptor, as it will give you an indication of how I came to love Shakespeare so much, and I believe my own journey with the bard is relevant. I'm going to jump back to 1977, the year after I left high school. I did my national service in one of the most exclusive units in the South African Defence Force. Before you become worried that I was a member of some sinister, secretive, behind-the-lines commando group, let me reassure you it was nothing like that. However, of the 11,000 conscripts who reported in the January of that year, I was one of only 15 national servicemen to be selected for one meteorological unit. See the size of it. It wasn't a difficult selection process. I think the 15 of us who were selected were the only 15 who knew that the unit existed. What has this got to do with Shakespeare? After being posted to Grootfontein in Namibia, One of my fellow meteorologists and I applied to join the Weather Bureau as technicians as soon as we'd finished national service. We were provisionally accepted. Our plan was to head straight for Marion Island. We wanted to see what we'd look like if we didn't cut our hair or shave for a year. But the ship, the Agulhas, left Cape Town just a few days before our national service ended. And there was no way the SADF was going to let us leave early. So we both had to find a plan B. For Johan, that was studying geology at Pretoria University. For me, that was teaching. In 1979, I came to Rhodes University with the intention of studying to become a geography teacher. I felt that with my experience as a weatherman, I would have a head start in that section of the curriculum. My focus in my undergraduate years was on geography. I wanted to major in geography and psychology, but my results in matric were not that great. And the Cape Education Department, who offered me a teaching bursary that enabled me to attend university, had decreed that if I wanted a bursary, I had to major into proper subjects. My apologies to any psychologists in the room. I enjoyed English at school, even if my marks were not good. My English teacher told my parents at a parent-teacher consultation that I could consider teaching as a career, but I should never ever attempt to teach English as a subject. Ironically, I ended up as head of English at his alma mater. He was from St. Andrews College. My sister, who's 2 years older than I, had already completed her degree, and she had majored in English. She was one of those people who won the English prize every year at school. She told me quite flatly that I would not pass English 1 at Rhodes. So after 2 years of speaking nothing but Afrikaans, I started my studies in English with a degree of trepidation. And I must say, one thing thoroughly inspired me.
Sorry.
I've got to thank Malden van Wyk Smith for this, because as a first-year student, we were all herded into a lecture theatre, and he spoke to the English 1 students. What he said was that about half of the people in the room had won the English prize at high school. And after we wrote our first test, somebody who won the English prize would probably get the 150th highest mark. We wrote our first test. I remember it distinctly. I got 72% for it. There were people who were absolutely devastated they hadn't got a first. They were walking around looking for a tall building in Grahamstown. And I was walking around going, who's the man? So thank you, Melbourne. That inspired me. But my focus remained on geography. But there were 2 things that surprised me about the English department, and one other thing that impressed me. The surprises: firstly, I enjoyed English. And secondly, I didn't do too badly in essays and tests, and particularly in the exams. Let me put it this way. The lowest mark I got for an exam at university was higher than the highest mark I ever got for an exam in high school. Suddenly the marker was interested not so much in what I could regurgitate, but in what I thought, as long as I could motivate it with sound justification and with ever-improving spelling. And what impressed me, it was the caliber of the lecturers in the English department. John House was one of my tutors in all 3 years of my undergraduate years, and it was a privilege to be in the presence of such a great mind. Paul Walters lectured me, Malden van Wyk Smith, Chris Mann, whose lectures were always meticulously prepared. Such inspiration from so many greats. And Guy Butler lectured us on King Lear. Can you beat that? How can you not fall in love with Shakespeare when you are exposed to such brilliance? And I hope you'll forgive me for recounting just 2 memories of Prof. Butler's lectures on Lear. He would arrive in the lecture theatre with a bundle of notes which he would never consult, and then weave his magic. On one occasion, he was making a point about Goneril and Regan, which he had seemingly just thought of and plucked out of the air. And then he paused mid-sentence, and he said, "That's an interesting point. I think I'll write a book on that." On another occasion, he was still in full flow, 5 minutes after the lecture was scheduled to finish. A student in the front row nervously raised her hand and pointed out that some of them had another lecture to attend, which was starting shortly. He smiled benevolently and said, "That's fine, you leave, I'll carry on." So, through the efforts of the Rhodes English department, I came to love the language, and I developed a huge respect for Shakespeare. Although I still saw myself as a common man when it came to the study of Shakespeare's plays, I learned to thoroughly enjoy them. I will never forget the sense of achievement when, by my 3rd year, I discovered I could read the entire text of a new play in one long sitting that we were studying. Ironically, I was doing a 1-month camp in the Met Office at Waterkloof Air Force Base when my 3rd year results were released. You have no idea how good I felt when my mother read them to me over the phone. I achieved a higher mark for English in my final year than my sister did. There was also a letter in the envelope which included the reading list for English honours and an invitation from the Professor of English of the English department to register. Unfortunately, my father said, "Get a job." But I still also had my heart set on becoming a geography teacher, and that English was beyond this common man. However, in my HTE year, as I studied to become a teacher, I found that geography method was rather bland and restrictive. For the last 6 months of the course, we were taken by a headmaster from a renowned and strict Eastern Cape school who was on study leave. Things went wrong when we had to give a lesson to the rest of the method group. Much of my fellow students loved my example climatology lesson on the formation of berg winds. He found it quite unfunny. Perhaps naming the pressure cells required for this climatological phenomenon, I called them Harry the high pressure cell and Larry the lost fart low pressure cell. Well, it was a warm wind anyway. It was a step too far for him. He told me afterwards he certainly would never employ me, and I shouldn't use him as a reference. What was funny about that was about 15 years later, I met somebody from that class, and she said to me, "The only thing I can remember about geography method is Larry the lost fart low pressure." In contrast, our English method lecturer, Ken Durham, went out of his way to present English as a subject that could change people's lives. For the first time, I began to think that maybe teaching English might be a lot more fun. In 1983, I began my teaching career at Western High School. The post was for geography and English. The changes in the staffing before I arrived meant that in my first year, I only taught English. The first year was one of survival as I adapted to the change from university-level engagement with Shakespeare to the mechanics of secondary education in the 1980s in South Africa, and what schools thought the purpose of secondary education was. Perhaps this is best illustrated by the interview with my new employer before I was offered the post. In those days, most interviews took place over a payphone. I received a message that the headmaster would be contacting me at 6 p.m. So I made sure that I was close to the phone booth and would be able to answer the phone before one of the other students in the residence could give the usual greeting of Corey home for unmarried fathers, who you wish to speak to. I mean, really, getting a sentence in a preposition. By the time the phone rang, just after 6, I had mentally rehearsed answers to all sorts of philosophical questions about teaching, including an answer if I was asked whether I thought the edition of Shakespeare was still relevant. The headmaster asked just one question. I'd obviously made the mistake of putting on my application form that I could coach hockey. His only question, you guessed it, can you coach rugby? I lied in order to get the job. I'm now in my 43rd year at the chalk face, or whiteboard facing these days. And in those years, I've taught at least one Shakespeare every year. Usually 2 and sometimes 3 or 4. Perhaps I should add that fortunately I've never been called upon to coach rugby. But now I'm going to jump forward in time, and so I can focus more specifically about Shakespeare and every person, and how or whether Shakespeare will survive beyond academia. In 2019, I attended an advanced program English user conference in Johannesburg, where Chris Thurman advertised the upcoming SOSA International Conference in Cape Town. He explained that there would be 3 separate conferences, one aimed at school teachers, one aimed at drama practitioners, and one aimed at university lecturers or academics. I was sitting next to an old friend of mine, Lauren Schwartz, an English teacher from Cape Town. And when Chris mentioned the teacher conference, I whispered to her, hey, we've been teaching Shakespeare for years. Why don't we propose a paper? What started as a bit of a joke developed into a deep discussion over tea. Yes, we had been teaching Shakespeare for years. Between the two of us, we had close to 70 years' experience. We also both felt the need to push ourselves academically. There's always the fear when you've been teaching for so long that you become stale in your approach and stagnate. We needed a challenge. Our proposal was aimed at the teacher conference, but I was initially rather hurt to receive an email from the organizer saying they did not feel our proposal was suitable. However, they did think it would be appropriate for the academic conference. We felt really honoured and set about presenting a more academic paper, which was daunting, challenging, and ultimately very rewarding and a great deal of fun. We generated about 60,000 words of background notes before cutting that down to fit the time available. The theme for the conference was Shakespeare and social justice, scholarship in an unequal world. We both studied The Merchant of Venice and Measure for Measure, focusing on the interpretation of mercy. There's certainly a huge difference between the way Portia defines mercy and then dispenses it, while Isabel is steadfast in offering mercy to her accuser based on how she defines it. We also looked at the concept of othering in both plays. As always, it's fascinating to look at how many modern psychological conditions were described by Shakespeare years before they were named. Edward Said first identified the concept of othering in 1978, specifically related to how we apply mercy to outsiders or others. And this was expanded upon by Yanis Gabriel, and the word became part of common usage. But the conference itself, and there's us trying to look professional, the conference itself was a bit of a shock to me and does say something about Shakespeare surviving beyond academia. Lauren and I were the only 2 school teachers to present a paper. 15 international universities and 7 local universities were represented, and I will concede that their knowledge of academia was greater than ours. Perhaps that's a euphemism for saying that we always attempt to make presentations fun as well as intellectual. What shocked me, though, was the attitude that most of the academics had towards Shakespeare. Very few actually seemed to like Shakespeare. The only shining light appeared to be John Carney, who was in his late 70s in 2019. he participated in a very successful in-conversation interview with Renard, and his passion for Shakespeare really shone through. One of his best responses was that he hadn't ever played King Lear because he didn't think he was old enough yet. It seemed, however, that many of the speakers had travelled all the way to the conference, some from Canada and the United States, to dismiss Shakespeare as an irrelevant dweeb. And dweeb is in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's a dead, white, European male. One of the keynote speakers, who referred to herself as the Othello Whisperer, was committed to banning 4 plays from ever being performed again. As I said, the theme for the conference was Shakespeare and social justice, scholarship in an unequal world. Such a rich opportunity to explore everything he has written. But it seems counterintuitive to explore these possibilities while calling for his removal from university and school syllabi. To me, that's a bit like going on a motorcycle rally in a camper van. Perhaps one of the problems of studying Shakespeare at an academic level is that he has been studied for so long and so much has been written about him. How do you find something new to say? This is perhaps best illustrated by one of the papers that was presented at the 2019 conference. So, how's this for a trivia question at a pub quiz? In which Shakespeare play does the character Marjorie appear? Marjorie. Well, she doesn't actually appear as such, but she is mentioned in The Merchant of Venice. Now, the play is certainly a text that hones in on social injustice. But let's be honest, the character of Lancelot Gobbo is hardly the most obvious choice to focus on in that play. However, he was not the focus of the paper. Neither was his father, Old Gobbo, who says even less. The speaker, who is essentially repurposing a master's thesis for the conference, had chosen to write about Old Gobbo's wife and Lancelot's mother, Marjorie. Has the study of Shakespeare been exhausted? You will all have heard the analogy that a thesis is the process of taking bones from one grave and reinterring them in another grave. But let's face it, a lot has already been written about Shakespeare. So much, in fact, that we've come to doubt whether he actually wrote the plays or not. Had artificial intelligence been available at that time, we'd really be stuck. But back to the paper about Marjorie. In The Merchant of Venice, Lancelot Gobbo says this of his parents: being an honest man's son, or rather an honest woman's son, for indeed my father did something smack, something grow to, had a kind of a taste. How much can we infer from that? And all we get from Old Gobbo is, her name is Marjorie, indeed. The paper itself was certainly interesting and turned mainly on Lancelot's comment that his father had a kind of taste and investigated what kind of taste that was. I'm going to jump a bit further forward now. By the end of 2021, I had passed my sell-by date at St Andrews College and returned to Port Elizabeth. Or, if I want to sound better travelled, in 2007 I left Port Elizabeth for Grahamstown, and in 2021 I left Makhanda for Kabega. In 2022 I started on a part-time basis at the Port Elizabeth Montessori High School. At that stage, the high school consisted of just 15 pupils. In order to keep me busy, the owner decided that it would be a good idea to introduce the lower secondary pupils to Shakespeare. In Montessori speak, Lower secondary pupils are the equivalent of grade 6 and 7, generally 11 and 12 years old. Just a word about the Port Elizabeth Montessori School. It is different. It is small, caring, and gentle. There is no uniform in the middle or the high school, and all teachers are addressed by their first names. The school does the Cambridge International Syllabus, which is not easy. It is also an inclusive school, and every year I have taught there have been at least 2 Down syndrome pupils at the school in attendance. When I met a teacher from a similar school in Pretoria, he looked at me quizzically and he said, "St. Andrews to Montessori, how?" I was not sure how teaching Shakespeare to 11-year-olds would work, so I decided to start with Julius Caesar. Now, many people here who have taught will tell you that it's not always a good idea to introduce Shakespeare to pupils at too young an age. However, I was met by boundless enthusiasm. Every lesson began with pupils jumping up and down and yelling, "I want to read! I want to read!" This included 2 pupils in the class who are what today would be called special needs children. Neither of them is able to read much louder than a whisper. But they were determined to participate. Another pupil struggled with a stutter, yet magically, when she read Shakespeare, it almost disappeared. In my second year there, I had a pupil who seldom said a word in any class. But when we went through the plays, she would draw anime-style pictures of the characters. And based on her detailing, she understood them better than many high school pupils would. I'm going to show you some of her drawings just now. But first I'm going to show you a clip of the first group I took. And I gave them dialogues from Julius Caesar to read. So I divided them into groups of 2. And then I asked if wouldn't it be better to practice outside? Once they were outside, they decided it would be even better if they ran up and down the sports field while rehearsing. I think the term ADHD is euphemized as normal at the Montessori school. But, oh, we went to the pictures first, unless I missed them. Okay. Those are anime-style drawings of the characters from Hamlet. And all the little bits of the crosses if they dared, revenge please, okay, she's getting the story. And I love the close-up of Hamlet and that lovely wink from Ophelia. She drew those 2 years ago. So far this year, she said 1 word in class. I gave her a test back and she said, "Yippee!" Okay. And to me, that is boundless enthusiasm. The enjoyment they're getting out of that is wonderful. In the 4 years since I started at P. Montessori, the lower secondary group, and it changes every year obviously, has covered Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet, Twelfth Night, Midsummer Night's Dream, Hamlet, Henry V, King Lear, Much Ado About Nothing, and the Scottish play. One of the parents told me that her son had renamed every pet in their household after a character from Macbeth. I've frequently asked myself whether this is just Shakespeare light. While I use mainly original text, I've edited the plays extensively. Yes, I believe the pupils have a fairly good understanding of the texts we've read, certainly a better understanding than the age cohort. the moment, well, last week we finished Henry V. And I'm going to read you a mashup which one of my current students wrote. And what I did was I took some lines from Henry V and then lines from other plays by Shakespeare. And I told them they had to write a motivational war cry. I used the concept of a cento poem. I'm sure some of you have done this before, where you take about 5 poems and then pick lines out of them. So cento is Italian for patchwork. And they created a 10-line war cry. They took great delight in presenting them to the class. So you're going to see a clip just now of a tiny little girl called Lily. This is her mashup war cry. I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked. Fight, gentle sons of England, fight, bold yeomen. This story shall the good man teach his son. We whip these stragglers o'er the seas again. God and our good cause fight upon our side. For he that sheds his blood with me today shall be my brother. What shall I say more than I have inferred? Damned be him that first cries, bold enough. If we be conquered, let men conquer us, and not kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet. Playing around with the language is fun. Probably won't hear much of the next clip, but Lily's one of the smallest girls in this clip. What I did was gave them lines from Henry V in the original text, and then said, somehow or other, present this to the class, but I'm also translating it into more modern English. So, read it. Divide the class in half, you read it to the other half. How are you going to get this across? This is what we ended up with. Bit of a mess. That's Lily. But they basically just swiveled and had great fun doing that. Unfortunately, we're not really in a position to build on this foundation as they move to the high school, because the size and nature of the school and the demands of university entrance, the school does the Cambridge English language syllabus rather than the English literature syllabus. So the vast majority of the middle schoolers will not delve deeply into literature once they've moved to high school. It's interesting that South African universities seem to be far more keen on accepting pupils who have studied Cambridge language rather than the literature course. More evidence of Shakespeare being squeezed out of academia. However, by choice, in the last 3 years, 4 pupils have chosen to do English literature as an extra subject. And I am kind of proud to say that a pupil who finished her high schooling last year achieved the highest marks in South Africa for Cambridge AS literature. It was quite handy for her, though, that the Shakespeare she studied was measure for measure. It's a play that I know quite well now. But what of the future? It's sobering to think that by the time Shakespeare was my age, he'd already been dead for 15 years. But that was more than 400 years ago. Can he survive? Is he still relevant? So much has been written about this, so I don't think it's necessary for me to actually say that much. The themes in so many plays are so relevant to so many present-day situations. I don't think there's any need, really, to argue. Just say the words mad ruler, and anyone would think that Shakespeare could look into the future. There's just the justifiable argument that the language is too obscure to understand, and that because of this, the comedies fall flat. But a creative director can use situational comedy to enhance meaning, and then to try to show you a clip from, I might need that help from the guy at the back, but let's see if I can get him to play. First lecture that's ever had an advert in it. You should recognize the scene. So, even if you couldn't really see that, I think you can work out what's going on. Who would have thought you could bring a cell phone so cleverly into a play by Shakespeare? Shakespeare is also omnipresent. I'm not sure how many of you have watched Kunk on Shakespeare, but if you haven't, this will probably be the first Shakespeare Birthday Lecture in which you get homework. Find it on YouTube and watch it. Do not make the mistake I did of watching it with a glass of red wine in your hand, especially if you're sitting on a couch which is upholstered in light fabric. I've spat wine all over the place. Just two nuggets. The Tempest is a story that doesn't make sense. Shakespeare fans like it because it shows they understand it, which they don't. And my favourite is her opinions on Romeo and Juliet. The two families are the Montagues, who sound quite posh, and the Capulets, who invented the headache tablet. Soon, Romeo and Juliet are in love, although they come from different families, which is how we know it isn't set in Norfolk. Shakespeare might be sliding out of favour at university, but it might just be a question of fashion. Bell-bottom trousers and double deniming were in fashion when I was at university, but they thankfully faded away, although for all I know they might have come back into fashion. Shakespeare survives and sometimes thrives in schools. The IEB syllabus has contained a Shakespeare play for grade 12s every year since its inception. And while Shakespeare is not a compulsory choice in the CAP syllabus, for grade 12s, he is still there, and many schools still study him. The study of Shakespeare will endure long after we are gone. Those who love him may be few, but we are a happy few, and a strong band of brothers and sisters. I'd like to end off by a quote from a contemporary artist and someone who I think is one of the finest philosophers of the 21st century, the graffiti artist Banksy. They say you die twice. One time when you stop breathing, and a second time a bit later on when somebody says your name for the last time. Shakespeare, I believe, will be alive everywhere for all time, both amongst academics and every person.